From the New York Times, it's The Headlines. I'm Tracy Mumford. Today's Thursday, March 20th. Here's what we're covering. As the clash between the Trump administration and the courts intensifies, Elon Musk has now stepped into the fray with his checkbook. Yesterday, Musk made the maximum allowable donation to 7 Republican lawmakers who have all either called for judges who've ruled against the administration to be impeached or endorsed other actions in that vein. He gave each of them $6,600. The drumbeat to aggressively challenge the judiciary has been growing louder in recent days, as the White House has been facing off with a federal judge over deportation flights. The judge has been pressing the government's lawyers about whether the administration ignored his order to stop the flights. In response, Trump, Musk, and some Republican lawmakers have been framing the judge as a liberal activist who needs to be thrown out. Musk, now putting his money behind that effort, shows how ready he is to use his resources to back lawmakers who support the president's most radical moves. The attacks by Trump and his allies on the judiciary, which is supposed to have equal power to the executive branch, have raised fears that the country's system of checks and balances is cracking. The standoff between the Trump administration and the courts also appears to be raising the threat of violence against judges. After Trump's calls to impeach the federal judge in the deportation case, social media lit up with threats, taunts, and images of judges being handcuffed. And in recent weeks, there have been a flurry of attempts to intimidate judges across the country, including bomb threats and swatting attacks, where heavily armed police storm people's homes after false 911 calls. The U.S. Marshals Service even put out a bulletin warning of a new tactic seemingly designed to intimidate judges. People are sending Domino's pizza deliveries to their houses as a way of showing that they know where they live. Now, 2 updates on the education front. Later today, President Trump is expected to sign an executive order aimed at dismantling the Department of Education. The administration has already made deep cuts to it, but now Trump will instruct the Secretary of Education to shut down the agency altogether. It's not clear how that would happen. By law, only Congress has the authority to close it, and no modern president has ever tried to unilaterally eliminate a department. Many of the programs the department runs support low-income students and students with disabilities, and multiple polls show closing the department is unpopular. About 2/3 of Americans oppose the idea. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is ramping up its targeting of universities. Yesterday, the White House said on social media that it's suspending $175 million in federal funding for the University of Pennsylvania because the school allowed a transgender woman to compete on its women's swim team 3 years ago. The university said it hadn't received any official notification from the government, but the cuts would be the latest in the Trump administration's efforts to punish colleges for policies that don't align with the president's agenda. It previously paused a large amount of funding for Columbia over how the university handled what it said were anti-Semitic protests on campus.
Forecasting is always very, very hard, and in the current situation, I just think uncertainty is remarkably high.
At the Federal Reserve, Chair Jerome Powell acknowledged that President Trump's on-again, off-again, on-again tariffs could be taking a toll on the economy. Powell said the tariffs may be undermining their efforts to get inflation back down to the Fed's goal of 2%.
I think we were getting closer and closer to that. I wouldn't say we were at that. I do think with the arrival of the tariff inflation, further progress may be delayed.
Against the backdrop of Trump's new trade policies, the Fed's now predicting higher inflation and slower growth for the U.S. economy. And Powell announced that the Fed is holding interest rates steady for now. Investors seem to welcome that decision. Stocks ended the day higher than they started after several recent nosedives. In North Dakota, a jury has ordered the environmental group Greenpeace to pay more than $660 million for its role in oil pipeline protests nearly a decade ago. The case centers on the Dakota Access Pipeline. In 2016, concerns about its potential environmental effects set off high-profile protests on and around the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. Thousands of demonstrators set up camp there. At times, some protesters turned to vandalism or violence, and the pipeline company Energy Transfer sued Greenpeace over it, accusing the group of funding and supporting efforts that delayed construction and harmed the company's reputation. Greenpeace denied that, but jurors sided against the group.
It was a pretty full courtroom. There were a lot of Greenpeace staff members and supporters. There were a number of activists who had been involved with the Standing Rock protests who had also come to watch the verdict.
Karen Zrake has been covering the trial for The Times. She says the verdict wasn't unexpected. The jury pool pulled from an area where a lot of people have connections to the oil industry. The large financial penalty will primarily affect one specific arm of Greenpeace, Greenpeace Inc., which organizes public campaigns and protests. The group has warned it could now go bankrupt. But Karen says the verdict is an alarm bell for activists in all kinds of fields, because it feeds into a growing trend of tougher penalties for protests.
One of the people watching in the courtroom was Martin Garbus, who's a noted First Amendment lawyer. He's been working on these issues for many decades. I spoke to him afterwards, and he told me that this was the worst First Amendment case decision he had ever seen. He said that it could really have a chilling effect on any protest group because the risks would just be too high, that any group involved in a protest could be blamed for anything that happened there.
And finally,
I'm Caroline Hopkins Legaspi. I'm a reporter on the Well Desk at The Times. And one of the things we do is keep an eye out for nutrition trends that we see popping up all over the place. Then we'll turn to experts and ask, whether there's any truth behind these health claims.
My favorite cooking fat is, drumroll please, tallow.
Lately, I've been taking a closer look at beef tallow. Beef tallow is rendered beef fat. It's basically just fat that's taken from the tissue that surrounds a cow's organs.
Just plain potatoes, salt, and beef tallow.
I'd started to see it advertised on bags of tortilla chips, potato chips. I also saw restaurants advertising their switch to frying in beef tallow.
This steakhouse is called Meat. I got my fingers crossed. They don't use seed oils for the steak. Let's go find out.
A big part of the reason people have been embracing beef tallow is that there's been growing criticism about the alternative, which is seed oils. Seed oils include canola oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil.
Seed oil is one of the components of processed foods.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as Secretary of Health and Human Services, he is claiming that they're poisoning Americans, that they're causing chronic disease.
You taste these, it's a completely different experience.
Last week, RFK Jr. went on Fox News, sat down at a Steak and Shake restaurant, and celebrated that Steak and Shake had begun to fry its French fries in beef tallow instead of seed oil.
We're very grateful for them for RFKing the French fries. They turned me into a verb.
But I spoke to a number of cardiologists, dietitians, nutrition experts, and what I overwhelmingly heard across the board is that there's no health benefits of beef tallow. You're raising the amount of saturated fat you're eating, which in turn can cause high cholesterol and heart disease. And beef tallow is not something that people should be embracing as a health food. But even more than that, what I heard from these experts I spoke with is that embracing beef tallow is kind of a misguided health trend. Ultimately, instead of arguing over the best cooking oil to use when we fry our food, the healthier trend might be actually limiting fried food altogether.
Those are the headlines. Today on The Daily, 5 years after the beginning of COVID, a new book argues that there's no clear evidence pandemic lockdowns in the U.S. saved lives. An interview with the book's authors. That's next in the New York Times audio app, or you can listen wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Tracy Mumford. We'll be back tomorrow.